Is Nicaragua the other Venezuela? And is your teapot spying on you? All that and more coming up on the December 27th, 2018 episode of The Hot Zone.
This is The Hot Zone. Engaging with the news in a whole new way, international war correspondent Chuck Holton brings insight into areas of crisis and lets you help those affected.
I'm Chuck Holton. Rising allegations of espionage against China have people asking if spies are listening in on their phone calls. And they may very well be. But before we get to that, let's talk about Nicaragua. It hasn't been covered much in the U.S. press, but this is one hot zone that's already claimed more than 500 lives this year. Let me give you a little background on Nicaragua, and I apologize ahead of time that I don't have a lot of background footage for these stories today, so you'll just have to watch me talk. Sorry about that. Nicaraguan President Daniel Ortega is on his second go-round as the leader of Nicaragua. See, he was president from 1979 to 1990, and he took a little break, and he came back to power again in 2006 and has had a stranglehold on the government ever since. He even installed his wife as the vice president last year. Now, Ortega is a straight-up Marxist, and he was the leader of the brutal Sandinista movement, if you might recall, back in the 80s when my friend Oliver North was trying to help out the Contras during the Nicaraguan Civil War. The Sandinistas were known for such things as mass extrajudicial executions and other fun human rights abuses while they were in power. Ortega won the election in 2006 by promising massive welfare programs to the nation's poor. When Ortega took office, he immediately started cozying up to Venezuela and for a period of years received hundreds of millions in aid from that country until Venezuela's corruption and socialism, but I repeat myself, decimated that country's finances, and it was no longer able to shovel cash at its Latin American neighbors. And that's when the wheels started to fall off for Daniel Ortega. See, when you promise people lots of free stuff, it doesn't take long for them to come to believe that they're entitled to all that free stuff. And then when you run out of other people's money, the thin veneer of civility that covers society wears out very quickly. So for the last 10 months or so, there have been a massive amount of riots and violence in the streets across Nicaragua. Students, workers, and business owners have all banded together to call for Ortega to step down. And in true despotic dictator fashion, Ortega has dealt with the crisis by sending troops to quash the protests, jailing journalists, and kicking NGOs out of the country. Ortega claims he's going to stay until the end of his 8th term in 2021, when rumor has it he plans to rig the election so his wife can become president after him. Sound familiar? During his reign, Nicaragua has mostly been a safe and peaceful place to visit. I've been there myself. Totalitarian countries very often seem safe and clean and tranquil on the outside, but it stays that way out of fear. See, a dictator will make your family disappear if you scare off some tourists, so you're probably going to be as nice as you can. But once the government can no longer care for people from the cradle to the grave, then look out, and that's what we're seeing in Nicaragua. Well, we've seen this in the United States with even localized disruptions in entitlements. We've had protests and sit-ins, remember the Occupy movement, and then Walmart gets pillaged like it did in October 2014 when EBT cards temporarily stopped working in Mississippi. Many of the protests I've covered in the U.S. over the last year contain some element of socialists, and they literally sometimes wear signs around their necks that say, "Socialism is the answer." Well, if socialism is the answer, I think you're asking the wrong question. Okay, let's move on to another fun socialist paradise, the People's Republic of China. The Chinese government's been full court press on both spying and espionage around the world for many years. In Russia a few years ago, they found thousands of tea kettles that came from China that had Wi-Fi sniffers built into the plastic handles. So I guess you bring the tea kettle home and then it automatically hacks into your router while it's making your tea and starts sending all your personal data back to Beijing. Isn't that lovely? But that's just the tip of the iceberg. The Red Army has literally hundreds of thousands of hackers working for it, and they break into anything and everything they can around the world. I mean, their targets don't even have to have any military or strategic importance. They'll hack into Taco Bell as eagerly as they will the Pentagon. A few months ago, a memo went out in the U.S. Defense Department warning U.S. service members not to own any phone made by ZTE or Huawei or others, a few others.
Earlier, Facebook facing new criticism for sharing user data. The newest bombshell that it gave information to 4 Chinese firms, including Huawei, a company U.S. intelligence has flagged as a security threat.
Because those phones come with a special feature. They send all your location, call, and browsing data back to China to feed their insatiable appetite for information. Now, those 2 brands are huge here in Panama. As a matter of fact, I own a Huawei phone myself. Oops. But I don't use it very much anymore. So you can imagine how excited I was to hear that the Chinese president, Xi Jinping, was coming to Panama to meet with the Panamanian president. What's that all about?
So I'm right downtown Panama City, and this empty road you see behind me is something you never see in downtown Panama, and that's because they've completely closed the main thoroughfare going through town so that the Chinese president can leave. He's been here for the last couple of days speaking with the Panamanian president, and they've been talking a lot about economic things and about the canal and stuff like that. But here along this road, they have lined the road with flags of China and Panama together. That signals a new level of cooperation between the 2 countries, and that cooperation is very concerning to the United States. So I went to the embassy here to talk to some people about why that is.
Well, as I said there, I went to the embassy hoping for an interview and got stiffed. Such is the life of a journalist. But suffice it to say, the Americans are not exactly jubilant about the Panamanian government cozying up to China, especially when Panama has access to at least a little bit of U.S. intelligence, which helps them catch drug traffickers coming through the country and things like that. But the closer they get to China, the further away they get from U.S. influence. And we don't want to be sharing our intel methods and stuff with China. So that has major implications for U.S. national security. And side note, no, China does not own the canal. That's an urban legend that just won't die. There was a Chinese company called Hutchison Whampoa years ago that got the contract to manage the ports on both sides of Panama for the last decade. But Panama, and only Panama, runs the canal. But what's the most concerning about China? It's that it's taking huge strides in the development of artificial intelligence. And AI runs on data. So much of what China is doing by scooping up information about your phone records and Netflix purchases and Uber rides has to do with helping China beat those companies at their own game, with the ultimate goal of making China the sole superpower on Earth and the United States merely an afterthought. So to sum up, the FBI said earlier this month that Chinese spying doesn't just threaten the future of the United States, it threatens the future of the world. So there's that. In a congressional hearing earlier this month, E.W. Prystap, Assistant Director of the FBI's Counterintelligence Division, testified at just how severe this threat is. I'm going to read this to you because, frankly, it's really frightening. He said, quote, "Make no mistake, the Chinese government is proposing itself as an alternative model for the world, one without a democratic system of government, and it's seeking to undermine the free and open rules-based order we helped establish following World War II." At an earlier meeting called the Aspen Forum, another FBI official named Michael Collins said this.
The threat that China poses to U.S. national security, economic interests, political well-being, and the international order we stand behind is not necessarily coming from the country itself, its rise, its contribution to international well-being, nor from the diaspora or the Chinese citizenry in general. It's under this leadership which increasingly has been aspiring, expanding its ambitions, its interests, its activities around the globe to compete with the United States and at the end of the day to undermine our influence relative to their influence. By their own terms, and what Xi Jinping himself enunciates, I would argue by definition, John McLaughlin raised this issue early in describing Russia, but what they're waging against us is fundamentally a Cold War. A Cold War not like we saw during the Cold War, but a Cold War by definition. A country that exploits all avenues of power, licit and illicit, public and private, economic, military, to undermine the standing of your rival relative to your own standing without resorting to conflict. The Chinese do not want conflict, they do not want war, they do not want conflagration. But at the end of the day, they want every country around the world, when it's deciding its interests, its decisions on policy issues, to first and foremost side with China, not the United States. Because the Chinese are increasingly defining a conflict with the United States and what we stand behind as a systems conflict. I mean, read in Xi's writings, socialism. He's not just talking about socialism, he's talking about socialism with Chinese characteristics directed by the Communist Party of China. It sets up a competition with us and what we stand behind far more significantly by any extreme than what the Russians could put forward. And last, let me just close. I worry in their influence campaigns about the political interference, the media interference, the economic interference, and all the things that Director Wray spoke about. But I worry as well about their interference in our thought. They are fundamentally trying to encourage those of us, the Chinese diaspora more broadly, those with whom they have influence, to think their way about governance and not perhaps the way we would advocate or we would prefer, the United States would prefer. We think about things like the liberal international order.
So it's not so much that China sees us as their enemy. They see us more as prey. And they're hunting our technology and our economy and anything else they can get their hands on. And they will be absolutely ruthless in surpassing the United States every way they can. So ask yourself this: how much of the electronic technology you use every day comes from China? If you're like me, you probably don't have any idea, but you can imagine that the majority of the electronics you interact with, from televisions to security cameras to electric toothbrushes, all come from that communist country. See, China is perfecting the art of using that technology to spy on its own citizens and control their behavior through a social credit rating. That's scary stuff, but they aren't keeping it just in China. Many of these same technologies are seeping into American culture, from facial recognition scans at airports to creditors mining your Facebook contacts. This great article in Defense One yesterday asked the question this way: how far will societies pursue security along paths paved by dictators? Good question. So basically, you should be very concerned about the Chinese surveillance state, because it's not staying in China. It's already here. And frankly, we have no idea how it's going to change our lives in the coming decade. Well, that's all for today, folks. Thanks for being with us. Back again here tomorrow. See you then. I'm Chuck Holton, and you've been watching The Hot Zone.
The Hot Zone is produced by Amy Holton and Livefire Media. Copyright 2019.